Today we are blessed to have with us Reverend Dr. Robert Prichard, or Bob Prichard, as he's known to many. He is retired professor of church history and liturgics at Virginia Theological Seminary. He was one of my professors when I was at VTS. And we also, of course, have our curate, Reverend Will Dickinson, with us as well, as we are learning more about worship in the 1700s and giving some context to our service of worship that we will have experienced on October the 31st as part of our 300th anniversary. So welcome, Dr. Prichard.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be part of this conversation.
So, as people who go through this liturgy, which is from the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, will notice a lot of differences. And we want to ask you about some of those. And also, but before we get into the actual liturgy itself, I wonder if you could just sort of give us a sense of the context of what worshipers in Virginia in the middle part of the 18th century, what was that experience like for folks?
Well, I think that Virginia, like Massachusetts, was a colony in which most of the people in the colony went to one church. Particularly in 1750, most of the people in Virginia were part of the Church of England, and that meant that when you gathered together for worship on Sunday morning, it was the gathering together of the community. Every county had at least one Episcopal church, and quite often three. Virginia counties seem to be sort of skinny going east to west, and so you often had a church in the middle, a church in the east, and a church in the west. And the smaller ones in the east and west were called chapels of ease. So at the time when you saw your neighbors, people were serious about going to church and would stay in church on Sunday morning for several hours. There are reports that sometimes that was the only time the community gathered, so it wasn't unusual for people after church to hang around in the churchyard and transact business that they didn't have a chance to do at other times.
So in Fredericksburg, where we are, and as the church didn't start out in Fredericksburg, it started out somewhat to the south of us, but we're going to kind of move ahead to the time when there was the first church here in downtown Fredericksburg. Folks would have been coming from probably quite a distance to gather. And as you said, not just for the purposes of worshiping, but for seeing other people. Tell us a little bit about how worship would have been different in a place like Virginia versus, say, over in England, where they had been doing this for a long time. How did worship change in the colonies versus over in England, even though they were using the same liturgy?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that are going on. One of them is Virginia and America in the whole colonial era has no bishops. So anything that a bishop would have done at a time of visitation, or anything you would have done in a cathedral, simply doesn't happen in the colonies. So, for example, English canon law directed different clothing for clergy in cathedrals and in local parishes. And so the fancier cathedral vestments wouldn't have been known in Virginia because we simply had no cathedral.
So
go ahead. Yes.
It was normative here that communion was not celebrated very frequently. Why was that?
Well, there's a long tug of war. Same thing would have been true in England. There's a long tug of war that really goes back to about the 13th century. But basically, clergy had this vision that people ought to have communion every Sunday, but they also have a sense that communion is a very holy thing, and they warn people about receiving unworthily. And the result is that nobody comes when communion is offered. Thomas Cranmer in 1549 imagined the every Sunday communion, and then he had to repoint the prayer book in 1552 to count for the fact that nobody came. In the Roman Catholic Church in the 13th century, a church council had to decree that people go to communion once a year because people didn't even go then, didn't even go that frequently. So the issue is this. In his letter to the Corinthians, his letters to the Corinthians, St. Paul warns that receiving communion unworthily endangers your salvation. And the church and the people had such a high expectation of what that meant that people simply didn't show up to communion. And so the medieval Roman Catholic Rite doesn't even have a place communion. Now there's a gradual move forward, but until the 20th century, almost nobody is receiving communion, no normal parishioner, more than 4 times a year in any church, even in the Roman Catholic Church, even though the Eucharist may be celebrated more frequently than that. So I think it's in part the 20th century rethinking of the understanding of penance and penitence that opens up more regular reception of communion. So if you look at the fine print, 1662, there are descriptions, there are these speeches, exhortations the priest is supposed to read, first telling people not to receive unworthily, and then when they don't come, telling them, please come, you should receive communion. There are instructions that you are to tell the priest in advance if you want to receive communion, because that's such a rare event. And there is a provision that, the prayer book says only confirmed people can receive. And there's nobody confirmed because there are no bishops in the colonies. So in 1662, they add a caveat. Anyone must be confirmed or desirous and ready to be confirmed. So you signal to the priest in effect teaches a confirmation class to people who will never be confirmed. And then at the end of the class, those people who are ready and desirous in the priest's estimation begin to receive communion. But again, it happens 4 times a year that communion is offered. That seems to be about the maximum number of times that you actually can get people to receive if you're a clergy person who would like that to happen.
They were willing to take that chance 4 times a year.
Yes, and often, even at Virginia Seminary, 1940s, before the communion was celebrated, which was not very frequently, there was a quiet day, a day of repentance when people prepared for the receiving of sacrament.
Wow.
I'm sure that
in the 19th century, so there's a real sense of the gravity of what you're doing when you come forward to receive communion.
Sure that our congregation will be grateful that we are not reading the whole length of the exhortation to them. But Dr. Prichard, you touch in your answer on something that I bet that a lot of our folks will notice, which is that the role of the clergy and the laity and how involved each of those roles are in the liturgy is quite different in the 62 prayer book from what we're used to. Could you speak a little bit about that?
There are older members of your congregation who remember the days when there were no lay readers. It wasn't actually until 1970 that the Episcopal Church changed the rules, or it's in the 60s, I guess, or 1970. General Convention changes the rules to allow lay readers to read in the presence of a priest. Before that time, lay readers were only to read when the priest was absent. which was necessary if you had one priest in three churches, as many Virginia counties did. So the priest sometimes would be at one of those other places, and so you needed lay readers who were were paid for reading the service. But the priest did all the reading, and the people only responded in a limited number of times. If you look at the Catechism in Use before 1979, there's a line to parents of those to be baptized and to godparents in which they say, the priest says something like, will you teach them the creed, the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, and all things necessary for salvation? And so those are the parts of the service that are said by members of the congregation. So if you know the Apostles' Creed and you know the Lord's Prayer and the commandments, you pretty much know the parts you're going to say. And in case you don't, many colonial churches had those texts on the wall on tablets for people to look up at, so you could follow along if you could read. Even the confession in the Eucharist was said by the priest on behalf of the people.
There is a part where it says that where the Lord's Prayer is a call and response. In the communion service, it says the priest speaks and the congregation responds. And I guess I assumed that was because of the fact that people were not literate.
Well, it may, I don't have the text before me, but you will notice that at the beginning of the Eucharist, the priest goes and stands before the altar and says the Lord's Prayer, it may say in a low voice. So there are multiple times. The Lord's Prayer shows up at least 3 times on a Sunday morning, and maybe more. So that may be signaling for the people to follow, as opposed to the priest just reciting it, the priest alone.
So is all of this, as you mentioned earlier, just the caution about receiving communion, is that why the tenor of the service is so penitential, why there's so much kneeling?
Well, I think there is a rhythm to the service. John Booty, who was a late 20th century church historian, wrote a book about this, 3 Anglican Divines on Prayer. But he said there's a kind of rhythm to the service. And it is, the rhythm is this: we acknowledge our sinfulness, and then we hear the good news of God's forgiveness, and then we're filled with joy. And then as our minds stray and we realize our unworthiness even to be forgiven, the cycle starts over again. So, for example, morning prayer and the Eucharist had separate cycles of lessons on days in which there was the Eucharist and morning prayer, like Sunday. The morning prayer lessons often focus on how bad people are and the wrong things they did and the difficulty they got in and the need for repentance. And then when you get to the Eucharistic celebration, it focused almost entirely on Jesus. So it's only New Testament lessons, and the prayer, the Eucharistic prayer, is about what Christ has done for us. So there's a kind of, we acknowledge our sin, we receive Christ's forgiveness, and therefore we're joyful. And but that acknowledging sin is made, today we penitent in the Eucharist. The priest invites you to receive, to confess. And there's a rubric that says silence can be kept. And there's almost no place where that's longer than about 10 seconds. So that's what you get. And then you confess. That's very different from reciting the 10 commands one after another, 10 commandments, and responding to them, to having heard the lessons from the Old Testament, which are so often lessons of misconduct, and then repenting. So I guess you could say there's a movement which moves more slowly, as indeed the whole service does. And we seem to jump pretty quickly to celebration today.
Right, right. Thank you. That's really helpful context.
So one of the things that folks love most about St. George's in its current form, in our current day, is our music. And it's very wide ranging and involves jazz and contemporary music, and of course also what we consider standard hymns. But most of what is standard for Anglicans is, of course, mostly codified in the late 19th and early 20th century. Can you give us an idea of what our 18th century ancestors would have experienced as part of St. George's music-wise?
Well, let me just say in general about Protestant churches. Lutherans were an exception because of the remarkable character of Martin Luther. But in general, Reformed Christians and Anglicans didn't sing anything except biblical text after the Reformation. And part of the thinking was most of the bad theology of the late medieval period was contained in hymns, saints' hymns and hymns about the role of Mary and other things. And the answer to that was to say, hereafter, the only things we'll sing are going to be biblical text. And that rule kept in Reformed and Anglican churches into the middle of the 18th century. So what did people sing? They sang psalms, they sang biblical canticles, and the one exception, they sang a few hymns of the very early church, mainly the Glory and the Te Deum. Everything else was a biblical text that they sang. And then by the 18th century, there's a kind of foot in the door. People start creating metrical psalms. So they're psalms that sound a little bit like hymns, but they're, the King of Love, my shepherd is. Everybody knows you're singing the 23rd Psalm, but you're singing paraphrases. And copies of the prayer book in America and in England were often accompanied by metrical psalms. The Great Awakening, the Great American and British revival that took place beginning in about the 1740s was in part the occasion of hymns of modern composition, which often focused on the character of faith and of individual believers. Amazing Grace, how great the sound that saves a wretch like me. Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Those are sort of great hymns, and I think the singing of contemporary hymns in the British Isles probably started in Wales, and we still have some of those old Welsh tunes in our prayer book. The General Convention moved very carefully in hymns, and up until about 1890. All the prayer books simply had a few hymns stuck at the back, and they had to be approved by General Convention. And they include a few Wesley hymns and a few classics, but it's not until about maybe it was 89 that it's about that period of time when we finally have a separate hymnal. And even then, the music is not directed as to what tune you use for any particular hymn. So it's a long time coming, and in some cases, particularly high church bishops are not enthusiastic. There is a fight in Maryland, and a priest is tried about 1815 for the crime of singing unauthorized hymns. And he leaves the Episcopal Church and forms the Evangelical Episcopal Church, which doesn't go far, but it is an indication that there's real conflict over that, over the singing of modern hymns. So St. George's probably may have had a simple organ early on, but it would have been used to sing metrical psalms and regular psalms, and then the canticles in morning prayer.
Yeah,
The
thank
idea
you.
of a processional, the idea of a processional and a recessional hymn to start and end the Eucharist only appeared in rubric in 1979.
Ah, interesting. Interesting. Well, another thing that will be a little different when we do this service is the priest will stand on the north end of the altar, which essentially means that the priest will be facing south instead of what we would typically face out toward the congregation. And before that, people remember when the priest faced east. Why does this service instruct the priest to face to stand on the north end?
Well, I think that at the Reformation, there was a reaction among Protestant churches of anything that made it look like the people were not able to approach God themselves, but only the priest could do that. And I think the sense of many Protestant churches was that having a priest celebrate the Eucharist with back to the congregation gives the idea that only the priest can pray for us, only the priest is part of that drama at the altar. And so there was a general Protestant rejection of that. And in the way it worked out in the Church of England was that the priests began to celebrate the Eucharist in profile, so that to the congregation. So the priest could be seen, and there wasn't any magic going on at the Eucharist. That is, in medieval church, there was a screen separating the congregation from the priest, and there were parts of the prayers which were called the secret, which were said in a low voice, and so the congregation couldn't understand what was going on. So part of the focus of the churches at the Reformation was to say people should see and hear, and so priest is going to be turned around. All those words, some of which were secret, are now in the prayer book in the language of the people to see what's being said. And in terms of manual actions, of which there were not many, during the Eucharist, all of that would be visible because of the priest position facing at right angles to the congregation.
That's really helpful. You also, which we were talking before this call, mentioned that on the altar, there wouldn't have been anything on the altar, no candles. And why was that? Was that also because of kind of a resistance, or I guess a reaction against the Roman Catholics?
I think it is part reaction. What the prayer book says is, rubrics at one point are you can only use candles insofar as you need them for light. So you could have a candle if you were in a dark church, but if you're worshiping the morning and you have windows such that you can see, the idea was you don't want to put the simple act of praying over bread and wine is something should be visible, and you don't want to have an elaborately set table with other things. And so it won't be until the 19th century that there is the introduction of flowers and candles on the altar, and it occasions great discussion in the life of the church because some people find that an unwarranted innovation.
I think it speaks to an interesting tension where, of course, things that feel germane and normal to us, like a gospel procession, for example, have their genesis in the church in a necessary act. You need to carry the book out amidst the people so that they can hear you. You need the candles to go with it so that you can actually see what you are reading. But over time, those become sort of calcified within the liturgy itself. And it's an interesting experience, I suspect, to try and pare back as many of those sort of unnecessary, so to speak, parts of the liturgy. And I bet that for our folks this morning, it will be an interesting experience to see, oh, maybe that thing that feels really central to my experience of the service isn't actually totally necessary to it in the first place. But that tension between those two things feels like it really colors the Anglican experience of what is necessary, what is aesthetic, and what of the aesthetic is feels intrinsic. That's not a question, but.
Yeah, but two quick thoughts on that. One of them illustrative of how critical this can be. There's a funny story that circulated in the 1960s in the church in Virginia about a priest who got very full of the ideas of the liturgical movement. And one of them was that everything should be utilitarian. We ought to have only such elements in our worship as are needful. And so he told the congregation that he was going to take out something unnecessary every week until they were struck with what was essential for Anglican worship. So he tried this for several weeks, and then the quip was, and the congregation then realized they could do without that priest. There's always a question about what's essential, what's not. But in the colonial era, there was a strong idea about audibility, and the idea was that you had a high pulpit, and you had the building designed so nobody, if with their sitting, could be any further than 50 feet from the preacher. And if the church got bigger, they then made it T-shaped so they could add more people in a wing. And if it got even bigger, they made it cross-shaped. So churches like the Bruton Parish in Williamsburg are cross-shaped, and that's not from some design, cosmic design or shape of the cross. It's for audibility. And they called people who went to church in the 18th century auditors because they were the ones who could hear the word read and preached. The funny thing about that is if you preached in one of those churches, it is the best way to be heard is not to look at the people. If you raise your head up, then your voice is bounced off the ceiling and you're perfectly heard everywhere. If you begin to look down, particularly to the people near the foot of the pulpit, other people begin to lose your voice. But they were very mindful of having a design which allowed voices to be heard from the pulpit.
Wow. So, well, we will be using our sound system on October 31st. But that's really interesting, and I think the original St. George's Church on this site was they did that very thing. I think they added to it as it got a little bit larger in the way that you described. So as we draw this conversation to a close, is there anything else that you would want people to know or want people to think about having experienced this worship? And just to note that we are not trying to recreate perfectly what worship would have been like in the middle of the 1700s, but to give people an experience of worship using an earlier liturgy. But anything else that you would want people to consider or reflect on?
Well, I would just call attention to the time factor. Worship in the 18th century in an Anglican church took about 3 hours in the morning, and there weren't stacked services, no early service. There might be evening prayer, but there wasn't, we were not sort of using the same space 3 or 4 times in the morning. Sermon could be 45 minutes to an hour. Not only was morning prayer read in full with its lessons and psalms, but also the full litany, and then either part or all of the Eucharist. And it's just worthwhile to reflect that still, if you go to some parts of the world, you'll find Anglicans still do that. They spend 2 or 3 hours on Sunday morning in church, and it's a major commitment of time. Interestingly, as we have gotten more time-saving devices, we're less willing actually to spend time together. So people, if you have anything approaching an 18th century service in the United States today, people would begin to get rather itchy after 1/3 of the service has gone by. But people committed large portions of their time on Sunday to the act of worship as a way of laying their life before the Lord and celebrating the goodness of his love toward us. And they didn't have to race home to watch football on television.
That's true. That's true. Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on, just the purpose of worship, just being to lay our lives before God. And I hope that worshiping God with some words that are similar to some we might be familiar with and different in many ways will truly be an act of worship. And I look forward to hearing how people experience it on the day. We really appreciate your giving us this very helpful context and details, Dr. Prichard, and thank you so much for your time. Can you just tell people where you are in Virginia? You've been in Virginia a long time. Where are you now?
Well, I'm in Middlesex County, Virginia at this point, which is, if you go out to the river and simply follow it to the bay, you're in Middlesex County. You go down the Rappahannock. In a little county where my grandfather grew up and where I spent a lot of time as a child. So I will be at Christ Church Middlesex, or I guess we now call it Christ Church Saluda, on Sunday morning, thinking of you all and including you in my prayers of thanksgiving as you celebrate your history.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and all that you shared with us.
Thank you so much.